The red Ferrari roared through the busy downtown streets like a metal beast on the hunt. Behind the wheel sat Blake Morrison, 28 years old and worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. His designer sunglasses reflected the afternoon sun as he gripped the steering wheel with one hand and held his phone with the other. "Listen, Peterson, I don't care what the board thinks," Blake shouted into his phone, his voice cutting through the purr of the expensive engine. "Tell them if they don't accept my offer by 5 o'clock today, I'm walking away from the whole deal. There are plenty of other companies I can buy and flip for profit." He glanced at his gold watch and cursed under his breath. He was already 20 minutes late to meet his friends at the Platinum Club, the most exclusive hangout spot in the city. Only members with net worths above $50 million could even get through the front doors. Blake had been a member since he turned 21, thanks to his father's wallet, of course. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, but Blake didn't even think about slowing down. Why should he? Rules were for regular people, not for someone like him. He pressed harder on the gas pedal and the Ferrari shot forward like a rocket. Yeah, whatever. He continued talking to Peterson, his business partner. "Just make sure those idiots understand who they're dealing with. My father didn't build a billion-dollar empire by being nice to people. Money talks, everything else is just noise." As Blake approached the crosswalk, he barely noticed the pedestrian signal had changed. People were starting to cross the street, going about their everyday lives, carrying bags and talking on their phones. To Blake, they were just obstacles in his path, no different from traffic cones. Lisa Park stepped into the crosswalk, her hands full of grocery bags and her 7-month pregnant belly, making her movement slower than usual. She had just finished her shift at the city hospital, where she worked as part of the cleaning crew. Her feet hurt, her back ached, and all she wanted was to get home to put her feet up and rest. The paper bags in her arms contained simple things: bread, milk, some vegetables for dinner, and a small container of ice cream she had bought as a treat for herself. Working while pregnant wasn't easy, but Lisa and her husband needed every dollar they could save before the baby arrived. She looked both ways before crossing, just like her mother had taught her years ago. The walk signal was clearly on her side. She took her first step into the street, then her second, moving carefully because of her condition. Blake was still talking loudly into his phone when he saw the woman in the crosswalk. But instead of hitting the brakes, he barely slowed down. In his mind, she should have been moving faster. Didn't she see his car coming? "Watch where you're going," he shouted out his window, even though Lisa was exactly where she was supposed to be. The collision happened in slow motion, or at least that's how Lisa would remember it later. One moment she was walking across the street thinking about what to make for dinner, and the next moment she felt the front bumper of the Ferrari hit her side. Lisa fell to the ground, her grocery bags flying in different directions. Apples rolled across the asphalt. The milk container split open and spread white across the dark street, and pieces of bread scattered like confetti. But none of that mattered to Lisa. Her hands immediately went to her belly, protecting the baby inside. The Ferrari came to a stop about 20 feet past the crosswalk. Blake sat in the driver's seat for a moment, more annoyed than worried. He looked at the front of his car and saw a small dent in the bumper. "Great, just perfect," he muttered, ending his phone call. "This is going to cost me a fortune to fix." He got out of the car, adjusting his expensive jacket and checking his appearance in the car's side mirror. Several people on the sidewalk had stopped to watch what was happening. Some were already pulling out their phones to record the scene. Lisa was still on the ground, trying to sit up but moving very slowly. She was conscious and alert, but clearly shaken up. Her work uniform was torn at the knee, and she could feel scrapes on her hands where she had tried to break her fall. Blake walked over to where Lisa was sitting, but not to help her up. Instead, he looked down at her with the same expression he might give to a piece of trash on the sidewalk. "Look what you did to my car," he said, pointing at the small dent. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost to repair?" Lisa looked up at him in disbelief. She was the one who had been hit. She was the one sitting injured on the street, and he was complaining about his car. "Sir, I think I need an ambulance," Lisa said quietly, still holding her belly. "I'm pregnant and I'm worried about my baby." Blake rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. You're barely even hurt. Look, you can get up and walk around just fine." But Lisa wasn't fine. She could feel pain shooting through her side where the car had hit her, and the stress of the situation was making her feel dizzy and sick. "Please," she said, her voice getting weaker. I just need someone to call for help. Blake pulled out his wallet and counted out several $100 bills. Here's $500 cash. Take it and forget this whole thing happened. We both know you're not really hurt that badly. The small crowd of people watching was getting bigger. Blake noticed several phones pointed in his direction, recording everything he said and did. This was the last thing he needed. Some viral video of him dealing with this mess. I'm Blake Morrison, he announced loudly to anyone within hearing distance. My father owns Morrison Technologies, and we have lawyers who handle situations like this all the time. Anyone thinking about causing trouble should think twice. But Lisa shook her head, pushing away the money he was trying to hand her. I don't want your money. I just want to make sure my baby is okay. Please, someone call 911. An older woman from the crowd stepped forward and knelt down next to Lisa. Honey, don't worry. I'm calling for an ambulance right now, she said, dialing the number on her phone. Blake threw his hands up in frustration. This is ridiculous. Lady, you walked right in front of my car. If anything, you should be paying for the damage to my vehicle. The light was green for pedestrians, called out a man from the crowd. I saw the whole thing. She had the right of way. Mind your own business, Blake snapped back. You people don't understand how this works. My family has more money and power than all of you combined. We can make problems like this disappear. But even as he spoke those words, Blake could hear the distant sound of sirens getting closer. The ambulance was on its way, and probably the police too. This simple little problem was turning into something much bigger than he had planned. The ambulance pulled up to the scene with its red and blue lights flashing, followed closely by 2 police cars. The paramedics jumped out and rushed over to Lisa, who was still sitting on the ground with the older woman who had stayed by her side. Blake watched from beside his Ferrari, tapping his foot impatiently and checking his watch again. He was now almost 40 minutes late to meet his friends, and this whole situation was becoming a major headache. Detective Carlos Rivera stepped out of the first police car, and his experienced eyes immediately took in the scene. He saw the expensive red sports car, the scattered groceries still spread across the street, and the pregnant woman being checked by the paramedics. Then his gaze settled on Blake, and his expression changed. Well, Detective Rivera said under his breath as he walked closer. Blake Morrison. I should have known. Blake looked up as the detective approached, and his face showed a flicker of recognition. They had met before, unfortunately. Detective Rivera, what a surprise, Blake said with fake friendliness. I hope we can handle this quickly. I have important business to attend to. Detective Rivera pulled out his notepad and pen. I'm sure you do. Blake, just like you had important business 6 months ago when you were caught racing your Lamborghini through a school zone at 90 miles per hour. That was completely different, Blake protested, and my father's lawyers handled that situation perfectly. Right, they handled it by paying a lot of money to make it go away, the detective replied. But money can't always fix everything, especially when someone gets hurt. Meanwhile, the paramedics were carefully helping Lisa onto a stretcher. One of them, a young man named Tony, was taking her blood pressure and asking her questions about how she was feeling. Ma'am, we're going to take you to City General Hospital for a full checkup, Tony explained gently. We want to make sure both you and your baby are doing okay after what happened. Lisa nodded weakly. The shock was starting to wear off, and now she could feel the pain more clearly. Her side hurt where the car had hit her, and she was worried sick about whether the accident had harmed her unborn child. Can someone please call my husband? Lisa asked the paramedic. His name is Dr. Park, and he works at the hospital. I have his number in my phone. Tony found Lisa's phone in her purse and handed it to her so she could find the contact information. Don't worry. We'll make sure he knows what happened and where to find you. Blake overheard this conversation and walked over to the ambulance. Doctor? Your husband is a doctor? Lisa looked at him with tired eyes. Yes, he is. And he's going to want to know why someone hit his pregnant wife and then tried to pay her off instead of making sure she was okay. Blake laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Let me guess. He's probably some small-time clinic doctor or maybe works at a community health center. Well, let me tell you something, lady. My father owns half the medical facilities in this state. One phone call from him and your husband could be out of a job tomorrow. Detective Rivera heard this exchange and shook his head. Blake, I strongly suggest you stop talking right now. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Against me? Blake's voice got louder. Detective, this woman clearly walked in front of my car on purpose. This is obviously some kind of insurance scam. These people see an expensive car and think they've hit the lottery. Several witnesses who had stayed at the scene began speaking up at once. That's not true.
Called out the older woman who had helped Lisa. I saw the whole thing.
She had the walk signal and she was crossing normally until your car hit her. The light was definitely green for pedestrians, added the man who had spoken up earlier. This young man was speeding and talking on his phone. Blake turned to face the crowd, his face red with anger. You people have no idea what you're talking about. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my family is? Detective Rivera stepped between Blake and the witnesses. Okay, that's enough. Blake, I need you to calm down and answer some questions, and I need to see your driver's license and insurance information. Blake pulled out his wallet, but instead of handing over his license, he pulled out a business card. Here's my father's personal attorney's card. Richard Morrison doesn't just own Morrison Technologies. He owns 3 hospitals, 2 medical research facilities, and more real estate than you could count in a lifetime. One call to this number and this whole problem disappears. Blake, I don't care if your father owns the moon, Detective Rivera said firmly. Right now I'm investigating a traffic accident where someone got hurt. Give me your license and registration. Reluctantly, Blake handed over the documents. Detective Rivera examined them and began writing in his notepad. The ambulance was getting ready to leave with Lisa inside. As they loaded her stretcher into the back, she called out to the detective, Officer, please make sure you get witness statements from everyone who saw what happened. I don't want this man to lie about what he did. Blake walked closer to the ambulance and his voice took on a threatening tone. Lady, you have no idea what you're getting into. My family has made bigger problems than you disappear without a trace. We have lawyers who eat cases like this for breakfast. Detective Rivera grabbed Blake by the arm and pulled him away from the ambulance. That's it. You're done talking to the victim. In fact, you're done talking at all unless you want to make this situation much worse for yourself. But Blake couldn't help himself. As the ambulance drove away, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Go ahead and waste the hospital's time. When your nobody husband shows up, he'll realize he's way out of his league. My family owns this city? Detective Rivera looked at Blake with disgust. You know what, Blake? I've dealt with a lot of entitled rich kids in my 20 years on the force, but you might just be the worst one I've ever met. Entitled? Blake laughed. Detective, I'm not entitled. I'm realistic. I understand how the world really works. Money talks and everything else is just noise. We'll see about that, Detective Rivera replied as he continued taking witness statements. One by one, the people who had seen the accident told the same story. Blake had been driving too fast, talking on his phone, and had hit Lisa while she was legally crossing the street. Several people had even recorded parts of the incident on their phones. Blake watched nervously as more evidence piled up against him, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. He pulled out his own phone and dialed a number. Dad, it's me. I need you to call our lawyers right now. Some woman threw herself in front of my car and now she's trying to blame me for the whole thing. Yes, I know you're in meetings, but this is important. Detective Rivera finished interviewing the witnesses and walked back over to Blake, who was still on the phone with his father. Blake, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give an official statement, and I suggest you call a lawyer. Because based on what I've heard from multiple witnesses, you're going to be charged with reckless driving at minimum. Blake ended his phone call and glared at the detective. This is harassment, and you know it. That woman is fine. She got up and walked to the ambulance by herself. She's 7 months pregnant and was hit by a car traveling well over the speed limit, Detective Rivera replied. The fact that she could walk doesn't mean she's not seriously injured. Blake looked around at the crowd of people still watching him, many of them shaking their heads in disapproval. For the first time since the accident happened, he began to realize that this situation might not be as easy to fix as he had thought. But Blake Morrison had never backed down from a fight in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. He had money, power, and connections. How much trouble could one pregnant woman and her doctor husband really cause? The emergency room at City General Hospital was buzzing with its usual afternoon activity. Nurses moved quickly between patients. Doctors reviewed charts and families waited anxiously in the plastic chairs that lined the walls. Lisa was wheeled in on a stretcher, still clutching her belly protectively. Room 7 is open, called out Nancy, the head nurse, as the paramedics brought Lisa through the automatic doors. Dr. Williams is waiting for her. Lisa felt scared and alone as they moved her from the ambulance stretcher to a hospital bed. The bright lights overhead made her squint, and the antiseptic smell reminded her of her daily work here. Though she had never seen this side of the hospital as a patient, Dr. Williams, a kind woman in her 50s, came into the room with a warm smile. "Hello, Lisa, I'm Dr. Williams. The paramedics told me what happened, and we're going to take very good care of you and your baby." "Is my baby going to be okay?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky with worry. "The car hit me pretty hard and I fell on the street. We're going to run some tests to make sure everything is fine," Dr. Williams assured her while checking Lisa's blood pressure. "The good news is that your vital signs look stable, and the baby's heartbeat sounds strong." Meanwhile, back at the accident scene, Blake had finally convinced Detective Rivera to let him leave, after promising to come to the police station the next morning to give his official statement. But instead of going home or meeting his friends, Blake had a different plan. He drove his damaged Ferrari straight to City General Hospital. In his mind, he needed to have a serious conversation with this woman before she got any crazy ideas about suing his family. Blake had seen too many cases where regular people tried to take advantage of wealthy families, and he wasn't about to let that happen. Blake parked his car in a visitor spot and walked into the hospital lobby like he owned the place. He approached the information desk where a young volunteer was working. "I need to know what room Lisa Park is in," he demanded. "She was just brought here by ambulance." The volunteer, a college student named Kevin, looked up from his computer. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can only give out room information to family members. Are you related to the patient?" Blake flashed his most charming smile, the one that usually got him whatever he wanted. "Actually, I'm the one who brought her here. There was a small accident, and I want to make sure she's okay." Kevin hesitated. Something about this man didn't feel right, but he couldn't exactly put his finger on what it was. "Well, I suppose if you're the one who called the ambulance," Kevin typed into his computer. "She's in room 7 in the emergency department. But visiting hours are almost over, and I should probably check with—" "Thanks, kid," Blake interrupted, already walking away toward the elevators. In room 7, Dr. Williams had just finished examining Lisa and was explaining the tests they would need to run. "We want to do an ultrasound to check on the baby, and I'd like to keep you here for observation for at least a few hours," the doctor explained. "You've been through a traumatic experience and sometimes problems don't show up right away." Lisa nodded, but she looked anxious. "Doctor, can someone please call my husband? I tried to reach him from the ambulance, but he didn't answer. He's probably in surgery or with patients." "Of course," Dr. Williams said. "What's his name and where does he work?" "Dr. Jonathan Park. He works here at City General, but he's usually in the surgical wing or the ICU. Can you have someone page him and tell him his wife was in an accident?" Dr. Williams raised her eyebrows slightly. "Your husband is Dr. Park?" "The chief of neurosurgery." Lisa nodded. "Yes, do you know him?" "Know him?" "Lisa, your husband is one of the most respected doctors in this entire hospital. He's saved more lives than I can count. Let me page him right away." Just then, Blake appeared in the doorway of room 7. He had walked through the emergency department like he belonged there, and none of the busy staff had stopped to question him. "Well, well," Blake said as he entered the room uninvited. "Fancy meeting you here." Dr. Williams looked up in surprise. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a private patient room." "Are you family?" Blake ignored the doctor and focused on Lisa. "I wanted to continue our conversation from earlier. I think you and I need to reach an understanding about what happened today." Lisa felt her heart rate increase and the monitors beside her bed began beeping faster. "Please leave. I don't want to talk to you." Now, Blake said in a condescending tone. "Let's be reasonable here. I know what this is really about. You see a rich guy in an expensive car and you think you've won the lottery. But I'm here to tell you that's not how this works." Dr. Williams stepped between Blake and Lisa's bed. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately. You're upsetting my patient, and that's not good for her or her baby." Blake laughed. "Lady, do you know who I am? My family donates more money to this hospital every year than most people make in their entire lives. My father's name is probably on half the buildings in this place." "I don't care if your name is on every building," Dr. Williams replied firmly. "You need to leave now or I'm calling security." Blake pulled out his phone and waved it in the air. "Go ahead and call security. While you're at it, call the hospital administrator and tell them Blake Morrison is here. Trust me, you'll get a very different attitude once they know who they're dealing with." Lisa was getting more upset by the minute. "Why won't you just leave me alone? I never asked you for anything." I just want to make sure my baby is okay. Your baby will be fine, Blake said dismissively. You're young and healthy, and it was barely a bump. But what's not going to be fine is your husband's career if he tries to cause trouble for my family. Dr. Williams had heard enough. She pressed the call button on Lisa's bed, which would bring nurses to the room immediately. And another thing, Blake continued, now pacing back and forth in the small room. I know exactly what kind of doctor your husband probably is. Some small-time family practice guy. Maybe works at a clinic in a rough neighborhood. Well, let me educate you about how the real world works. My father owns medical facilities all over this state. One phone call from him, and your husband will be looking for a new job. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, partly from pain and partly from frustration. You don't know anything about my husband. I know enough, Blake replied arrogantly. I know he married a cleaning lady who works in a hospital. I know he's probably struggling to pay the bills and keep up with his student loans. And I know that when he gets here, he's going to realize very quickly that he's completely out of his league. Two nurses rushed into the room in response to Dr. Williams's call button. They immediately saw the situation. Their patient was clearly distressed, and there was a strange man who didn't belong there making her upset. Sir, you need to leave right now, said Janet, the senior nurse. This is a private patient room and you're not authorized to be here. Blake waved his hand dismissively. I'll leave when I'm ready to leave. But first I want to meet this husband of hers. I want to have a man-to-man conversation with him about how these things really work. Just then, they heard rapid footsteps in the hallway outside. Someone was running toward the emergency department and they could hear a voice calling out urgently. Where is she? Where's my wife? Someone paged me about an accident. Blake looked toward the doorway with a smug expression on his face. Well, sounds like the husband has finally arrived. This should be interesting. Lisa's face lit up with relief despite her pain. Jonathan, I'm in here. Blake straightened his expensive jacket and prepared to meet the man he assumed would be just another ordinary person he could intimidate with his family's money and power. He had no idea that his entire world was about to change in the most shocking way possible. The footsteps were getting closer, and Blake could hear the man's voice more clearly now as he spoke urgently to hospital staff in the hallway. Is she hurt badly? Is the baby okay? I was in surgery when I got the message. Blake smirked and turned toward the door, ready to crush another little person who thought they could challenge the Morrison family name. Dr. Jonathan Park rushed through the emergency department doors, still wearing his green surgical scrubs. His hair was disheveled and there were beads of sweat on his forehead from the intense surgery he had just completed. The surgical mask hung loose around his neck, and his hands still showed traces of the antiseptic soap he had used to scrub out of the operating room. Blake looked at the man entering the room and immediately made assumptions. Here was just another hospital employee, probably a nurse or maybe a surgical technician. The guy looked tired and stressed, exactly what Blake expected from someone who worked for a living instead of living off family money. Finally, Blake said with a condescending tone, You must be the husband. I was wondering when you'd show up. Dr. Park barely glanced at Blake as he rushed to his wife's bedside. His entire focus was on Lisa, and his face showed genuine love and concern. Lisa, honey, are you okay? What happened? They told me you were hit by a car? Dr. Park took his wife's hand gently and looked into her eyes, checking her pupils like the trained medical professional he was. Lisa squeezed her husband's hand tightly. Jonathan, I'm so glad you're here. This man hit me with his car while I was crossing the street, and now he won't leave me alone. Blake stepped forward, assuming he was dealing with exactly the kind of person he had expected. So you're the famous husband I've been hearing about. Let me introduce myself properly. I'm Blake Morrison, and I think you and I need to have a serious conversation about what really happened today. Dr. Park looked up from his wife for the first time and gave Blake a cold stare. Are you the person who hit my pregnant wife with your car? Now hold on, Blake said, raising his hands dramatically. Let's not jump to conclusions here. Your wife walked in front of my vehicle. These things happen in the city. But I'm a reasonable man and I'm willing to work something out. Dr. Park's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice controlled and professional. Work something out? You hit my wife and unborn child with your car and you want to work something out? Blake smiled the same arrogant smile he had used 1,000 times before. Listen, pal, I understand you're upset, but let me explain how the real world works. My family has more money and power than you could imagine. We own businesses, properties, and yes, medical facilities all over this state. Dr. Williams, who had been quietly observing the interaction, tried to interrupt. "Mr. Morrison, I really think you should—" But Blake waved her off. "Please, doctor, the adults are talking here." He turned back to Dr. Park. "Now, as I was saying, my father, Richard Morrison, owns Morrison Technologies and about half the medical system in this area. So when I tell you that causing trouble for my family could be very bad for your career, I think you understand what I mean." Dr. Park's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Blake replied smugly. "Look, I get it. You're probably some small-time clinic doctor. Maybe you work in community health or something like that. You see a rich family and you think this is your big payday. But that's not how this works." Lisa tried to sit up in her hospital bed. "Jonathan, please don't listen to him. He's been saying terrible things ever since the accident happened." Blake continued his monologue, completely unaware of how badly he was misjudging the situation. "I'm sure you work hard for your money, Doc. Student loans, mortgage payments, trying to save up for the baby. I respect that. But you need to understand that you're swimming in waters that are way too deep for someone like you." Dr. Park stood up slowly, his full height now visible. He was taller than Blake had realized, and there was something commanding about his presence that Blake was only beginning to notice. "Someone like me?" Dr. Park asked quietly. "Yeah, you know what I mean," Blake said, his confidence still intact. "Regular people. Working people. People who actually have to worry about money and job security." That's when Dr. Williams finally found her chance to speak. "Mr. Morrison, I think there's something you should know about—" But Blake cut her off again. "Lady, I told you the grown-ups are talking. Why don't you go check on some other patients or something?" Dr. Park looked at Dr. Williams and nodded slightly. "It's okay, Patricia. Let him finish." Blake was pleased that the doctor seemed to be backing down. "See, now we're getting somewhere. You seem like a reasonable guy, Dr. Park." "Dr. Jonathan Park." "Right, Dr. Park. So here's what I'm thinking. I'll write you a check right now for $10,000. That should more than cover any medical bills, and you and your wife can have a nice little nest egg for when the baby comes. All you have to do is sign a simple agreement saying this was just an unfortunate accident and nobody was at fault." Dr. Park was quiet for a long moment, and Blake interpreted this as the man considering his generous offer. "Of course, if you're not interested in being reasonable," Blake continued, "I should probably mention that my father was just telling me last week about some changes he's planning in the medical facilities he owns. Budget cuts, staff reductions, that sort of thing. It would be a shame if your name somehow ended up on the wrong list." That's when Janet, the senior nurse, entered the room with a clipboard in her hand. "Dr. Park, I'm sorry to interrupt, but OR3 is asking when you'll be available for the follow-up consultation. They said Mr. Morrison's condition has stabilized, but the family wants to speak with you about the surgery." Blake froze. "Wait, what did you just say?" Janet looked confused by Blake's reaction. "I said they want Dr. Park to speak with Mr. Morrison's family about the surgery he just performed." Blake's face went white. "Mr. Morrison? Richard Morrison?" "Yes," Janet replied. "The gentleman who was brought in with the massive stroke about 4 hours ago. Dr. Park has been in surgery with him most of the afternoon." Blake stared at Dr. Park with his mouth hanging open. You were operating on my father?" Dr. Park nodded calmly. "Richard Morrison, age 58, suffered a severe stroke and was brought to our emergency department at approximately 2:30 this afternoon. I've been working to save his life for the past 3.5 hours. The room fell completely silent except for the beeping of Lisa's heart monitor. Blake looked like he had seen a ghost, but you can't be," Blake stammered. "You're supposed to be just some regular doctor." Dr. Williams stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, let me properly introduce you to Dr. Jonathan Park, Chief of Neurosurgery here at City General Hospital. He's one of the most respected brain surgeons in the entire country." Blake's legs suddenly felt weak, and he had to grab onto the wall to steady himself. "Chief of Neurosurgery?" "That's right," Dr. Park said quietly. "And for the past several hours while you were hitting my wife with your car and threatening my family, I was using every skill I have to try to save your father's life." Blake's entire world was crashing down around him. The nobody cleaning lady he had dismissed was married to one of the most important doctors in the state. The man he had threatened and tried to intimidate had literally been holding his father's life in his hands. Is my father going to be okay?" Blake asked weakly. Dr. Park looked at this young man who had caused his wife so much pain and trauma, and for a moment, everyone in the room wondered what he would say. "Your father is alive," Dr. Park finally answered. "The surgery was successful, but he's not out of danger yet. The next 24 hours will be critical." Blake slumped against the wall, suddenly understanding the full weight of what he had done. He had hit and threatened the wife of the man who had just saved his father's life. The irony was so overwhelming that he could barely breathe. "I need to call my mother," Blake whispered. "She must be terrified." Dr. Park watched Blake's entire arrogant facade crumble before his eyes. "Your mother is in the surgical waiting room on the 4th floor. She's been there all afternoon praying that I could save her husband's life." Blake Morrison stood in the hospital hallway outside his father's room, staring through the small window at the man who had raised him. Richard Morrison lay unconscious, connected to multiple machines that beeped and hummed, monitoring every aspect of his condition. Tubes and wires seemed to cover his entire body, and his normally strong, commanding presence was reduced to that of a fragile patient fighting for his life. It had been 6 hours since Blake learned the truth about Dr. Park, and the weight of his actions was crushing him like nothing he had ever experienced. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lisa falling to the ground, saw her hands protecting her pregnant belly, heard his own arrogant voice threatening the very man who had saved his father. Blake's mother, Helen Morrison, sat in a chair beside the bed, holding her husband's hand and speaking to him in soft whispers. She looked exhausted from hours of worry and fear, her usually perfect makeup streaked with tears. "The doctors say he can probably hear us," Helen said, when she noticed Blake watching through the window. "Dr. Park told me to keep talking to him. That familiar voices might help him wake up." Blake nodded but couldn't bring himself to enter the room. How could he face his father now? How could he sit beside the man's bed knowing that while Richard was fighting for his life, his son was terrorizing the family of the doctor who was trying to save him? A gentle knock on the wall made Blake turn around. Dr. Park was standing there, still in his surgical scrubs, but looking less exhausted than he had hours earlier. "How is he doing?" Blake asked quietly. "Better than I expected," Dr. Park replied professionally. "The surgery went well, and his vital signs have been stable for the past few hours. I'm cautiously optimistic about his recovery." Blake looked down at his feet, unable to meet the doctor's eyes. "Dr. Park, I have to tell you how sorry I am. What I did to your wife, the things I said to you. There's no excuse for any of it." Dr. Park studied Blake's face for a long moment. "You're right. There is no excuse for hitting a pregnant woman with your car and then threatening her family." The simple truth of those words hit Blake like a physical blow. "Is Lisa okay? Is the baby going to be all right?" "She's going to be fine," Dr. Park said. "We kept her for observation overnight, and both she and the baby are doing well. She has some bruises and she's shaken up, but there don't appear to be any serious injuries." Blake felt a small wave of relief, though it did nothing to lessen his shame. "What happens now?" Dr. Park crossed his arms. "What happens now is that you face the consequences of your actions. The police have already been here asking questions about the accident. Several witnesses gave statements, and there's video evidence from people's phones." Blake nodded miserably. "Detective Rivera said I need to come to the station tomorrow morning. Beyond that," Dr. Park continued, "you need to understand something very important. I've been a doctor for 15 years, and I took an oath to help people regardless of who they are or what they've done. I treated your father with the same care I would give to any patient despite what you did to my family." Blake looked up, confused. "Why? After everything I did, why would you still help my father?" "Because that's what doctors do," Dr. Park replied simply. "We separate our personal feelings from our professional responsibilities. Your father needed my help, and I gave him the best care I could provide." Just then, Helen Morrison appeared in the doorway of her husband's room. "Blake, honey, I think your father is starting to wake up. Dr. Park, could you please check on him?" Dr. Park nodded and followed Helen back into the room. Blake hesitated, then slowly walked in behind them. Richard Morrison's eyes were fluttering open, and he was making soft groaning sounds. "Richard, can you hear me?" Dr. Park asked, shining a small flashlight into the patient's eyes. "You're in the hospital. You had a stroke, but you're going to be okay." Richard Morrison's eyes focused slowly, first on Dr. Park, then on his wife, and finally on his son. His voice was weak and slurred, but he could speak. What happened?" Richard asked. Helen took her husband's hand. "You collapsed at the office this afternoon. You had a massive stroke, but Dr. Park performed surgery and saved your life. Richard looked at Dr. Park with gratitude. Thank you, doctor. I owe you my life. Dr. Park nodded professionally. I'm just glad we were able to help you in time. That's when Richard noticed his son standing awkwardly by the door. Blake, you look terrible. What's wrong? Blake felt his throat tighten. How could he tell his father what he had done? How could he explain that while Dr. Park was saving Richard's life, Blake was terrorizing the doctor's pregnant wife? Dad, there's something I need to tell you, Blake began, his voice shaking. Helen looked confused. What is it, honey? Blake took a deep breath and forced himself to speak. While Dr. Park was in surgery saving Dad's life, I hit his wife with my car. She's pregnant and I hurt her, and then I came to the hospital and threatened both of them. The room fell completely silent. Richard Morrison stared at his son with an expression of shock and disappointment that Blake had never seen before. You did what? Richard whispered. Blake couldn't stop now. The whole story came pouring out. The accident, his arrogant behavior, the threats he had made, his complete dismissal of Lisa as a nobody. He told them everything while Dr. Park stood quietly listening. When Blake finished, Richard Morrison closed his eyes and was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with shame. Dr. Park, I'm so deeply sorry for my son's actions. There is no excuse for what he did to your family. Dr. Park nodded. Your son has already apologized, Mr. Morrison. What matters now is what he does going forward. Richard looked at Blake with tears in his eyes. Son, I don't even recognize the person you've become. When did you turn into someone who could hit a pregnant woman and then threaten her family? Blake broke down completely. I don't know, Dad. I thought having money and power meant I could do whatever I wanted. I thought regular people didn't matter. Regular people? Richard shook his head weakly. Blake, Dr. Park isn't a regular person, he's an extraordinary person. But even if he was just an ordinary man, that wouldn't give you the right to treat his family this way. Helen Morrison looked horrified as she processed what her son had done. Blake, how could you? This man saved your father's life. Over the next few days, the consequences of Blake's actions began to unfold. Detective Rivera arrested him on charges of reckless driving, leaving the scene of an accident and harassment. The videos from witnesses' phones went viral on social media, showing Blake's arrogant behavior and threats. But the biggest consequence came from his own father. When Richard Morrison was discharged from the hospital a week later, he called Blake into his office for a conversation that would change both their lives. Son, I've built this company over 30 years, and I always plan to leave it to you someday, Richard said. But over billions of dollars to someone who uses wealth as a weapon against innocent people. Blake nodded, knowing this moment was coming. I understand, Dad. Do you? Richard asked. Because I'm not just cutting off your trust fund. I'm giving you a chance to prove you can change. You're going to work at the bottom of our company, earning minimum wage like everyone else. You're going to learn what it means to actually work for a living. Richard also announced that the Morrison Foundation would be making a substantial donation to the hospital's emergency medicine department in honor of Dr. Park and his wife. The donation would fund new equipment and training programs to help other families in crisis. Blake accepted his punishment without complaint. He moved out of his luxury apartment into a small studio, traded his Ferrari for a used Honda, and began working in the mailroom of his father's company. But the most important change came 6 months later, when Blake returned to City General Hospital, not as an arrogant rich kid making demands, but as a volunteer in the emergency department, helping other families during their most difficult moments. Dr. Park was surprised to see him but accepted Blake's offer to help. People can change, Dr. Park said, but only if they're willing to do the hard work required. Blake nodded, finally understanding what his father and Dr. Park had been trying to teach him. True worth wasn't measured in dollars or power. It was measured in how you treated other people, especially those who couldn't help you in return. Lisa and Dr. Park welcomed their healthy baby daughter 2 months later. Blake sent them a card with a simple message. Thank you for showing me what really matters.